How does Alice Madness Returns hold up against a gruesome gauge? Taking place 10 years after American McGee's Alice, despite defeating the Red Queen, Alice is still tormented by the memories of her destroyed wonderland. The first scene even shows her getting her face ripped off. There's an infernal train destroying everything. Alice must find a way to stop it, and find out why it's destroying Wonderland. While many of her old friends are suffering, their fates aren't as gruesome. Well, that's good for them, sucks for the show. The first game had these characters be dismembered, murdered, experimented on, and even got their heads blown off. The most we see is the walrus eating the dancers, as most other deaths are either implied or skipped on. Many of the enemies during the gameplay get ripped apart, which is good, but it still feels less violent than the first game. There is a scene where Alice turns giant, and she rips out several Red Queen hearts. The Red Queen's castle does a good job at salvaging some of this. The gauge gives it a 3 out of 5. My head's exploded and there's a steam hammer in my chest. How does Dead Space hold up against a gruesome gauge? An engineer, Isaac Clarke, and his team follow a distress signal towards the USG Ishimura. There they find out the entire crew was victim of an attack from creatures called necromorphs. Necromorphs are like zombies, except they mutate their host into several forms and can only be killed by shooting off their limbs. Throughout the game, you find other survivors, but only moments before their deaths, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's not just adults that are affected by this nightmare, as the lurkers are necromorphs of babies. It's not often you see children get involved in the corruption. Everyone on the crew is losing their minds thanks to the marker, as even Isaac begins suffering hallucinations. The deaths are just as gruesome, as in some cases, Isaac will simply go limp, while other times, he gets dismembered and decapitated. If killed by the infector, you can actually see him get turned into a necromorph. Dead Space gets a 5 out of 5. You're gonna have to shoot my arms off if you want me to stop playing. How does 1993's Doom hold up against a gruesome gauge? The fast-paced arcade-like action of the first Doom. You play as Doom Guy, as you make your way through halls full of demons to send them back from once they came. Imps, Cacodemons, and more will try to tear you to shreds. While in most games at the time when an enemy dies, they'll eventually disappear, but not in Doom. Their bodies will stay lifeless on the ground, which can make it easier to tell where you've been, and serve as a constant reminder of your actions. Anytime Doom Guy takes damage, he will grunt, and the icon down below will change to become more bloody. But while this game is fantastic, the disturbing factor is held back for aspects outside of the game's control, such as how later games, such as Doom 2016, would push the gauge even further. And there are even mods pushing what this game can do in its blood factor, like Brutal Doom. But if only the gruesome gauge was based on the game's quality. But here, we're judging games based on their edginess and disturbing factor, a 4 out of 5. Leaves a mess, but not as big as it would eventually become. How does 2016's Doom hold up against a gruesome gauge? I've already talked about the 1993 title on here, and there I mentioned that later games such as this one became even more gruesome. And no, that's not just because of the better graphics and higher detail. While that does play a part, the main reason is the game itself does not hold back. Enemies explode when shot with certain guns, the chainsaw tears through demons like never before, and now you have executions that make the violence go even further. Locations look like they've been through hell, including hell itself, with the blood from past massacres and body parts left behind. Everything gets a huge upgrade in the violence factor. It may be a personal bias due to my love for this game, but Doom 2016 gets a 5 out of 5 on the gruesome scale, a bloodbath of adrenaline. Keep playing, even if your femur bone's cracked in half. How does Freddi Fish, in the case of the missing kelp seeds, hold up against a gruesome gauge? You're probably thinking that this game can't be gruesome, it's just an educational point-and-click game from Humongous Entertainment. Yeah, sure, and I'm wasting my life with these videos. Now back to reality. The story is that someone stole Grandma Grouper's kelp seeds, and without them, she won't be able to plant them for the fish of the sea. So many people rely on her kelp seeds, to the point where even the king is aware of this thievery, and Freddy says that all the fish will die without it.
But we're looking for Grandma Grouper's kelp treasure. If we don't find it soon, all the fish are gonna die.
Yup, he said die. That's not a word you hear in cartoons unless things get serious. But Freddy is actually a sociopath. There's a point in the game where he can throw jellyfish, you know, fish, to feed at other fish and turtles. He's a fish feeding fish to fish! Dear God! And this part of the game isn't required. It's completely optional, so he's doing this for his own sick joy. And that's not all. In a desperate attempt to pass Eddie Eel, he gives him a peanut butter and tuna sandwich. And you know what tuna is? It's fish! He gave Eddie tuna! He's an abomination! So instant 5 out of 5 in the gruesome scale. Oh my god! How does Manhunt hold up against the gruesome gauge? You play as James Earl Cash, who's a death row inmate. However, instead of being killed, he is simply sedated, so he can kill other criminals for a man called the Director. The deaths here are gruesome and not their goriness, but instead execution, as if you sneak up to a character, you can execute them. By doing so, the game will change perspective, as Cash kills his victims with plastic bags or stabbing them in the throat. Every execution has a VHS filter over it, as they're meant to be snuff films. The deaths hold real weight, as characters struggle for their lives in each execution. But it's not just criminals who are affected. The homeless and even the main character's family are forced into this bloody hell. This caused the game to be banned in several countries, like New Zealand and Australia, and Germany confiscated all copies. There were even claims that the game inspired a real murder of a 14-year-old boy, but besides the killer owning a copy of the game, there's no evidence of a connection. It gets a 4 out of 5. I'd give it a 5, but needs more blood. How does Sonic.EXE hold up against a gruesome gauge? Now, of course, we're talking about the first fan game that was inspired by the creepypasta. The game starts off with a recreation of the intro of Sonic the Hedgehog, but for one frame, the oceans are turned into blood, and Sonic has red, bleeding eyes and a wide smile. Starting with Tails, you walk through a flat green hill paved with bodies of massacred flickies. Then he gets sent into a fiery hellscape where Sonic chases the fox. Knuckles is on a long metal path covered in blood. As he tries to confront Sonic, he gets killed as well. Robotnik is in a gothic-looking hall with a checkerboard floor as Sonic gets him as well. Then the final image shows up on screen. I am God. Now, there are other fan games that take the idea even further and try to create their own version of the story instead of just trying to recreate it. That, and while I love mindless violence, it isn't entertaining enough to justify it. A 1 out of 5. Here for a checkup? How does Pikmin hold up against a gruesome gauge? One of the early titles of the Gamecube. You play as Captain Olimar, who crash lands on an unknown planet with limited oxygen. His days are literally numbered, unless he can rebuild his ship. Thankfully, there are creatures he calls Pikmin that can assist him. He teaches the Pikmin how to surround their prey and beat them into a bloody pulp, much like how bees will swarm a wasp to kill it through heat. But these little guys aren't immortal. They can be killed by explosions, lit on fire, drowned, and crushed. When they die, they let out one last noise before their souls are freed. That's better than the enemies, as much like in Doom, the bodies remain, as you can harvest them for more Pikmin. The souls that leave their body may be for a cartoony effect to get kids not to think of death, but to me, that's nothing more than a confirmation of their end. Pikmin gets a 3 out of 5, just like Doom, as both let their bodies remain. How does Sanitarium hold up against a gruesome gauge? Sanitarium is a point-and-click horror game where you play as Max, who wakes up in an asylum with no memory and begins questioning his perception of reality, as he goes from the asylum to other strange locations, back to the asylum, and becomes other characters. Yes, there's a rhyme for the reason, but that would be spoiling things, and this isn't a review of the game, but instead its disturbing factor. Many of the demented characters in the game either act completely insane, harm themselves, or don't seem that well, to say the least. There's a town run by children, as their parents are consumed by an alien they call Mother. Experiments on the innocent in a comic book fantasy world, and a carnival on an island there's no escape from, as the people are in constant fear of a creature they believe will consume them. The unfortunate thing is that there aren't many deaths for the main character to endure, so the grotesque aspects mainly affect everyone else, so you are a witness to this disgusting mayhem. While the visuals may have aged, I think that actually makes it more disturbing. It's like practical effects in a horror movie. Sometimes the imperfections make the horror even creepier. On the gruesome gauge, Sanitarium gets a 5 out of 5. It's insane. Or maybe you're insane. How does Bioshock hold up against the gruesome gauge? After an airplane crash, you end up at a lighthouse. Entering said lighthouse, you end up in an underwater city called Rapture. As dreamlike as this place seems, it's going through a nightmare. Many of its people have lost their minds and have become what are known as splicers, thanks to the atom that gives them their unique powers. Throughout the game, you see people kill each other, as well as try to kill you. You also have the Big Daddies, who don't seem to be interested in you until you attack them or the little sisters that are following them. These guys can be terrifying to deal with, but the rewards can make it worth it. But unfortunately, these are the only enemies you really have to deal with, minus some turrets and security. There aren't that many unique deaths or violence, minus the standard stuff you get in most violent FPS games, but there are hidden lore through the audio diaries. See? Nightmares don't have to be just visual. 3 out of 5. While it doesn't get too messy, its atmosphere and secrets add more to the terror.